they're just thrown away and neglected and forgotten. And very often the writer becomes the person who can write about that, can tell those stories. We're really storytellers, and I think all three of us have lived that experience of the extraordinary strength of the story that is told. And that story is told, either it's told or retold, and that is a repetition, which is much stronger than the incantation, the enchantment of a Hitler or of a Gaddafi.
Well, Ahdas Suef, let me ask you to take the second part of Oliver's question, the issue of whether or not you think there might be a better or worse cooperation between the East and the West now that we're seeing the change in the Arab regimes, especially when it comes to the so-called war on terror.
Well, I think what I'd like to do is unpackage the question. He uses the terms the war on terror, and then he talks about intelligence sharing. So first of all, what is exactly this war on terror? I think that's a big question, and everybody would agree on that. And then intelligence sharing. Now, if we look at an aspect of the cooperation between Egypt and the West, specifically the United States, in the so-called war on terror, we come up with extraordinary rendition. So basically, Egypt, becoming a place of choice for prisoners flown over from the United States to be tortured. I would hope that these practices would completely end. And I think that this is a large part of what the Egyptian people want, that their country should stop being used to implement strategies and to implement policies that are inimical to the region, to the country, and to our moral and social well-being. Because of course, if you become a center for torture at the behest of the United States, then the filter down effect means that torture becomes endemic and systemic in society, which is what we have experienced. And so I think this whole thing of cooperation in the war on terror is going to need to be rethought.
Well, Hadaf, I want to put to you a couple of emails that we got, your impression or comments made by a couple of emails that we received. I'm going to read them back to you. The first one's from a viewer by the name of Hazan Baloch, who says, the words of writers and poets act as a mirror to their societies. They are bound to write on the problems of society to free people from stagnation. And the second email comes from the USA, from Ahmed Abdullah in Nebraska, who says, in the colonial era, poets and intellectuals inspired people to liberate their countries from oppression. No revolution can truly succeed without the intellectual elite. Now, I wonder, do you think it's that power of inspiration, Hadaf, that threatens oppressive regimes?
Well, I think that I think different arts, or even different literary arts, have different functions, and it's much easier to see the function of poetry in revolution and in rousing revolutions than it is, for example, to see fiction. But what fiction does as well, I think, is it keeps certain ideas alive, and it therefore keeps the ground fertile for revolutionary thoughts to take root. And I think that something that's really important in a revolution, and we saw it very much in the Egyptian revolution, is that people need to feel that they're not alone. And I think that it was that impetus when people came out on the streets and sort of recognized each other, and recognized that other people were coming out, and so on, that it all grew. And I think that art and fiction specifically do that. You read a passage and you recognize yourself in it, and you know that you're not alone, and you know that lots of other people are seeing and feeling the same thing. And it is, I think, in that sense that it helps big social movements along.
Hisham Matar, I want to get to you an email question, if I may, that came in from Uganda, from Kampala. Moses Smith wrote in saying, communication is only possible with an unifying language. The revolutions of North Africa were achieved through these people's cultural common denominator, Arabic. Do you believe that's the case, that having a common language across all these countries has helped the so-called domino effect that's taken place across the Arab world?
Well, perhaps. I mean, I think also culturally, maybe that's definitely a big part of it, is the language, but also more significantly, I think the culture and the experience of the political experience in the Middle East shares a lot of things in common. I am, though, slightly wary of the view that somehow writers are, fundamentally useful to a revolution. I think we serve a function just like a baker serves a function in a revolution. I don't think we're more important than that. Maybe even we're less important, far less important than a baker. And I see now in the Libyan revolution, it's a revolution that doesn't necessarily need writers. I feel, as a writer, I feel particularly useless during the revolution. And I'm also, I think, also wary of the opposing kind of view that is often romanticized in the West about sort of the writer under oppression and how somehow that state can, you know, inspire deep and incredibly good, urgent works. You know, I think, you know, I don't see any evidence for that. I see evidence that oppression stifles literature, it stifles thought, it stifles education and intellectual discourse. And I think also it does it for the same reason that Ariel Dorfman said earlier on, that writers do in some way exist against oppression, that you know, literature by its nature is rebellious, and it is interested in the multiplicity of life and in trying to understand and know the other, and it is filled with opposing currents of empathy, and so that, you know, doesn't you know, flourish under an oppressive regime.
Let's get Ariel Dorfman's impression on this, and also I can put it in terms of a. I was going to put it in terms of a question to you as well, because it touches on this issue that's been raised. It came from Kenya, from a viewer by the name of Max Kabuya in Otaya in Kenya, who says, revolution requires a common mindset to unite the people of a country. Intellectuals must help in creating this space by feeding the hearts and minds of people with nobler aspirations. So, listening to what Hisham had to say, I wonder what your view is.
I worry about the word must, always. Because must is the word that people like Gaddafi use. You must do this, you must do that. No, I think, look, I had the following experience. When I was during the 3 years of Allende, I was very often very doubtful about what literature was actually accomplishing, because there was so much being baked, to use the metaphor we've just used. There's so much being baked. There was so much bread in the air. It then became really important to me when there was this persecution and we were in exile and we were clandestinely making manuscripts go through, and there was a sense of, well, we're going to denounce the regime, but we're also going to try to understand what's happening. We're going to try to create a world and understand that world there. And I think personally that the most important thing that literature really does, it doesn't create noble aspirations. It is noble in itself, but in fact, it often can tell us about the worst things in human beings. And that's not a bad thing for us to be able to do as well. The humans in all their flaws, to know these things. I think that literature becomes particularly important now, at moments of transition, because that's a moment when there's a great deal of confusion. And literature, I think, can help not to create more confusion, but to create a language which is common to the understanding of the complexity of the situation. The situations in these countries that are undergoing these uprisings and these changes is incredibly complex, with enormous amounts of different energies coming from different places. People have never had this experience before. And I think this is the moment when literature becomes crucial to the mind of the country. But that mind is not one mind.